So let's talk about the rise and fall of the armies of ninth edition in a blow-by-blow army tier list. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a bit of a retrospective of the edition so far, and hopefully take a bit of a look at the crazy power creep of ninth edition in action. I feel like perhaps ninth edition is one of the fastest paced editions in terms of Games Workshop shaking up what armies are best, and it is kind of funny that just 2 years into the thing, several factions have risen, fallen, and risen again, despite us not even being at the point where all the armies have even got their ninth edition books yet. With that in mind, I thought we'd go through a rough tier list that moved as the edition updates went on. We'll start at the very start of ninth edition when the pandemic had a lot of us locked down, and move forward in time with each update, and roughly place the armies on this list of where I think that they stacked up. Obviously tier lists are always a little bit arbitrary. I wouldn't expect anyone to agree fully with every single ranking at every point throughout ninth edition, but I'll roughly try and explain my reasoning as to why I've ranked the factions where I have as we go along. Anyway, let's jump straight into it and start out with the 8th edition factions reacting to a new edition. So here's my very rough estimate of how the factions of 40k were stacking up right at the start of 9th. The new edition brought a whole load of really quite important changes from 8th edition. 8th edition often just tended to be a bit of a shooting gallery, a lot more about damaging the enemy's units as quickly as possible and removing them from the map, whereas 9th was a bit more of a different beast, much heavier terrain, smaller boards, more about scrapping for the central objectives and being durable. All sorts of other rules changed, as did points costs, so it quite radically shook up which factions were strong when it started. If we start off with some of the lower factions that really didn't get on with 9th edition quite so well, maybe one of the foremost amongst them might have been the Knights. Both the Imperial and Chaos ones really hated the new missions. They were pretty terrible at scoring primaries, which often meant that you could beat them even if you were heavily losing in damage. The secondaries punished them extra hard at the start as well, having easy ones for bringing down super heavies. Genestealer Cult had a lot of their units nerfed into uselessness just for points. They also didn't like the smaller boards quite as much for their deep strike tricks. Grey Knights and Thousand Suns both lost the ability to multicast Smite, so they couldn't do their Mortal Wound Barrage tactics anywhere near as well. Necrons had a bunch of new units from the Indomitus box, but it didn't really help them much, as they were the only army that hadn't received a new raft of rules from Psychic Awakening, and the new units just didn't really seem very aggressively costed, not compared with the Space Marine ones. Finally, Tau and Eldar really did hate trying to hold the centerboard. Most of their units just weren't really suited to durably holding objectives. In particular, Tau just absolutely hated 9th edition. Their shooting wasn't efficient enough to blow away enemies. There was so much more terrain, and with game turns being reduced, they also didn't have quite enough time to clear enemy units from objectives before moving up. Then in the more mid-tier, a few armies that underwhelmed a bit, but still at least had good play onto objectives or some strong power combos. Guard weren't too bad with the amount of durability that they could bring and moving bodies onto objectives. Drukhari weren't enormously strong, but at least they got on fairly well with secondaries, I suppose. And Tyranids and Chaos Space Marines both felt really quite underpowered, but at least had a few interesting builds, things like Swarm Lord plus Gene Stealers, or Emperor's Children Noise Marines, and Noise Bearers and Mass Possessed Blobs. Then, perhaps moving on to the strongest armies, it seemed that Marines and Harlequins were a bit of a head and shoulders above most others, Harlequins jumping up from a fairly mid-tier faction in 8th edition to getting on supremely well with the 9th objectives and using gunboats full of fusion pistols backed up with some Skyweavers to play a very hard game for most armies to counter. The Marines of course have been very strong since their new books halfway through 8th edition, in particular in early 9th, Salamanders really rose to the fore, double shooting Flamestorm aggressors with loads of mortal wounds, and of course pairing amazingly with the new Eradicators, which were super undercosted at time of launch at 40 points per model. Otherwise, for really strong armies towards the start of 9th, Custodians and Death Guard were absolutely loving things, stomping slowly towards objectives being very durable worked out great for them. Admech could still pack crazy amounts of firepower, with Cataphrone Breacher spam or Mars castles around Belisarius Core delivering crazy amounts of shooting. Sisters were just generally strong with their multi-melter Retributors and Repentia being massive damage dealers. Orcs got on okay with the objectives with their big fearless boy mobs and shock attack guns screened from shooting. And Demons were perhaps another surprise winner of early 9th. The shift to slow melee units holding central objectives worked well. Nurglings, Keepers of Secrets, and the very hard to kill Lord of Change, they all played their part. So in late 2020, the first codexes that were released were the Marine Codex and the Necrons, and the Marine Codexes being followed up by a whole bunch of supplements for things like Blood Angels, Space Wolves, and Death Watch. The Space Marine Codex was perhaps a little bit of a mixed bag. There were several nerfs to strong units, things like repulsors and aggressors lost double shooting, and much of the tank line got kind of made a bit redundant by the core keyword, not very well balanced at all against any of the infantry that did have it. Rising to the fore were perhaps the usual roster of units that you see at the moment: Blade Guard veterans and Vanguard veterans, Redemptor dreadnoughts and Eradicators, and Plasma Inceptors also went through a phase of being very, very strong. People initially weren't happy at all about the new Invader ATVs, thinking that their stat line was very much overpowered, and there was that slightly silly combo that you could do with the Chief Apothecary resurrecting the ATVs before it eventually got FAQ'd away. Overall, despite a few things being toned down, I think overall Space Marines did get stronger, and a few of the supplement books did add their own things. Space Wolves became very, very good with their Wolf Guard with jump packs, though neither Wolf nor Thunderwolves wound up being very good. Deathwatch had their interesting kill teams in the troop slot, which could give you things like Obsec Outriders, though it seemed to take a little while for people to catch on to the fact that Deathwatch could make some really good Dreadnought castles, which saw play later in 2021 in tournaments. Blood Angels, on the other hand, got a bit of a side grade. Their Chapter Tactic and the Sanguinary Guard remained absolutely great staples of the army list, but they lost an absolute ton of their mobility and delivery options, and kind of became Codex Sanguinary Guard. For the tier list, I have chosen to lump all the Space Marine sub-factions onto Space Marines for this one. I know in reality there is a bit of a disparity between the very strongest Space Marines and the very weakest ones. I'm largely having the Marine icon to represent the stronger options out of the section. Dark Angels were also still very, very strong at this point. They'd already got the Inner Circle rule for their Deathwing Terminators, though it had only helped things more when their book dropped in early 2021. Finally, Codex Necrons really brought a lot more units to the fray. The Silent King was really quite a nice power boost to the faction, and the big rules rewrite helped them out so much more than their new units had. Catan were looking genuinely scary again with the Nightbringer, big blocks of warriors were really hard to shift off objectives, and just being one of the few books with a 9th edition codex really expanded their options with their unique secondaries and things. Still though, I don't really think that they ever achieved top tier status, and early codex syndrome would certainly come back to bite them. Then, a little later in 2020, the Imperial Armor Index dropped. The Volkite Contemptor Dreadnoughts now became one of the best options for Space Marine Dreadnoughts. The Forge World Dreadnoughts for Custodies became very efficient indeed, to the extent where I think that it boosted the faction quite a bit. The Tyranids had one of the best sections of the bunch, with both things like Dimacarons and perhaps Hierodules as well really being quite standout. Dimacarons plus the Swarm Lord were really quite a scary combo. And the Guard got Death Riders, which suddenly became one of the most durable choices in the entire game, though Games Workshop did eventually swing the nerf hammer pretty heavily in response. Most of the other stuff seemed kind of okay to bad. The Space Marines and Guards didn't really have all that many meaningful choices out of their big Forge World motor pool, and the other factions that had relevant stuff were kind of limited. I guess the kill tanks for Orcs weren't a bad choice either. Then we went into early 2021, where Codex Death Guard provided really quite a huge power boost for the faction. The Codex had been delayed quite a long time due to the pandemic, but when it arrived it pretty quickly established itself as one of the strongest armies in the game, and they began absolutely cleaning up tournaments, with an awful lot of strong choices within the Codex. Plagueburst Crawlers were some of the most efficient vehicles in the game, Mortarion himself could hand out some crazy debuffs, the Terminators were awesome, the Foul Blightspawn and the Tallyman were both excellent support pieces, and Poxwalkers could be super cheap for objectives, and also vomit out a whole ton of mortal wounds. Not too long after, they also got that Terminus S Strike Force in the Warzone Charadon book, which could be a way to play Poxwalkers even stronger if you left the demon engines at home. Disgustingly resilient, giving -1 damage to a whole bunch of stuff, was also pretty problematic, as a lot of stuff was wanting to be 2 damage to fight off the Space Marines. Games Workshop had also issued a big FAQ around this time, with nerfs to Eradicators and Inceptors and Outriders for the Space Marines. Eradicators still remained good, but Inceptors and Outriders no longer were particularly top tier choices. For the Necrons, they buffed the Reanimator and nerfed the Nightbringer. They had a whole bunch of mission changes that helped tanks a little, and made Abhor the Witch a bit less punishing for Grey Knights and Thousand Sons. Imperial Knight Armigers got a bit cheaper, and Tyranid had some buffs to Hive Guard and Warriors. Tau really couldn't catch a break though, as their tactical drones went up to 20 points per model, meaning that you had to pay through the nose if you wanted extra shield drones. Most of these things weren't exactly seismic changes though, I'm not sure if they really affected the ranking of any of these on the list. Next though, 9th edition power creep really gets going. Shortly after the Death Guard, the Dark Angel supplement drops, basically now seeing like one of the very strongest ways that you can play Space Marines. Obsec Deathwing and Ravenwing are both excellent, and the vast majority of their supporting choices, like in Terramancy and Warlord traits and things, all do seem very similar or better to a lot of the other Space Marine dexes. Dark Angels and Death Guard clean up all the tournaments for a little bit, but then Games Workshop releases the Drukhari and Admech codexes, which really set the pace for 9th edition power creep. Drukhari come first, and perhaps their initial gameplay is just signified by mass raids of Rush. Pile a whole bunch of Witches, Incubi, and Trueborn into Raiders, support them with Drazar and some tooled up Succubi and an Archon, and just zoom them up the board as quickly as possible, get out turn 2, and charge and kill just about everything. If you wanted an alternative, then spamming nothing but Vrax with liquefy guns also seemed to work just as well. They also got the Cult of Strife supplement in that Warzone Charadon book that briefly allowed you a ridiculously silly Succubus combo where you could get double attacks doubled again. One witch character around about 60 points would usually kill around about 200 points worth of Space Marines in a single fight phase. Not to be outdone though, the Admech came shortly after. A lot of fun guns were amped up in the Codex, and Games Workshop really went to town on the layered buffs that the army could get. Canticles of the Omnissiah could give you some easy +1 to hits or +1 saves, and the initial Codex was kind of badly balanced. You could just absolutely hoover your opponent off the board with tons of core Iron Striders, and Rangers and Vanguard using their very strong stratagems. Maybe use Mars to get both Canticles and Doctriners. Sorry, I think I said that wrong earlier. The Doctriners are the ones that give you the +1 to hit and save. Or you could use Lucius's mobility to teleport yourself around the board and get those very tough Rangers and Vanguard where they needed to be. It was kind of apparent that Admech could quite comfortably hoover up things like Death Guard and Space Marines straight off the board, and then even before they had time to nerf them, they'd already dropped another supplement for them, the Veteran Cohort giving them another powerful way to play. Next up, moving into mid-2021, we got a fairly underwhelming chapter approved that really didn't do all that much. Most of the things mainly helped out internal codex balance rather than majorly buffing any of them, a few slightly token changes, and maybe a few nice buffs to Tyranids. Things like Gene Stealers went down a bit, as weirdly did the Spawnlord, despite already being very good. Drukhari had an FAQ that gave them a few emergency nerfs, Raiders went up a bit in points, as did Drazar. They stopped the crazy Dark Technomancer liquefy gun spam, but overall it didn't really do anything to alter their position at the top spot. Drukhari really had quite a lot of powerful choices to draw on if they needed to. The next codex was Sisters of Battle, who had really quite a large influx of new models and units, things like the Sacrosancts, Dog Martyr, and that new Castigator. Perhaps most notably of all for giving them a power boost was Morven Var, who had some pretty crazy rerolls going on for them. Sisters were definitely one of the armies in top tier contention. Things like Dominions piling out of Rhinos with Mortal Wound Stormbolters, and Repentia charging from reserve with Miracle Dice. Perhaps on a similar kind of level for Death Guard and Space Marines, but certainly not quite up to the heady heights of Admech and Drukhari. Following this, the demons get reinforcements in Be'lakor, the Dark Master having an incredibly threatening datasheet that can just cut straight through invuls, though he does cost a fair amount of points. His own private army of renown maybe isn't particularly inspiring, but he does work very well with Keepers of Secrets as another big scary threat that you can fling up the table. Nodlings and the Lord of Change both were nerfed slightly though in the recent chapter approved. The next codex is Orcs, and perhaps the first one that actually gives Admech and Drukhari a run for their money. Not the most internally balanced book either. A lot of their melee options are maybe a little bit underwhelming, but the thing that really breaks through and becomes top tier competitive is their freebooter Boggy and Plane spam. The competitive edge trait can allow all of their Orky shooting to hit on 4s once you've killed a unit, and it just means that if their shooting is halfway efficient already, then the units receive crazy buffs and the shooting phase becomes absolutely apocalyptic. Perhaps the most standout things are either plane spam with a whole load of dagger jets and was bombs, the rocket truck squig buggies that can throw out a crazy amount of ignores line of sight shooting, and Megatrack scrap jets for a massive barrage of rockets. There's plenty of other good stuff though, war bikers, and if you are going down a bit more of a melee route, kill rigs and the beast boss on a squigosaur. Then Admech get a reasonable sized nerf, their Iron Striders lose core, and the main damage dealing stratagems for their Skitarii troops are also toned down. Vanguard blobs aren't just going to be able to hand out 30 wounds to anything that they want to within range. Again though, like the Drukhari, it doesn't really tone down the faction all that much. Both Iron Striders and the troops are still fine, but a lot of Admech lists still keep a few of them and then switch to spamming loads of Sicarians, Rust Stalkers and Infiltrators. Next in line, in a couple of codexes that were delayed a fair bit, the Grey Knights and the Thousand Suns get their update, both of which are strong, but the Grey Knights a fair bit more so. The strongest Grey Knight army just seems very obvious: Mass Dread Knights and Grandmasters in Dread Knights, backed up by Grandmasters in Dread Knights and a whole bunch of Interceptors, and maybe a few strike squads to hold home field objectives. The Sword Bearers can make their Dread Knights hit very, very hard, and between reasonable damage and the shooting, psychic, and assault phase, they're a really hard faction to fight. Thousand Sons seem like they might be one of the more restrained codexes of 9th edition, though maybe still on this ranking they could have been up one tier more. Perhaps I should have put them on the B tier on this list. They do have a massive amount of strength and a lot of complicated things that you can do with their psychic phase. A large amount of Scarab Occult Terminators backed up by some Rubik Marines to hold objectives seems to be one of the best ways, combining their layered durability buffs and damage buffs with a very strong output of mortal wounds. Still though, not quite on the same sort of power level as the mighty Dread Knights of the Grey Knights. Moving on into September-October time of 2021, and the Black Templars get their Codex, accompanied by a fairly extensive Primaris refresh, new Sword Brethren, Helrecht and Grimoldus. They're certainly one of the stronger ways to play Marines, maybe on a similar sort of power level to Dark Angels, though they don't really seem like an entire level up compared with what's happened before. The Warzone Octarius supplements come out as well to follow Charadon. The Guard get their Cadian rules, which are minimally helpful, and maybe make Cadians one of the strongest ways that you can play Guard now, but I still don't think are massively more powerful than the other things that they had. The Orcs get the Speed Mob, another strong build for them. The Death Watch get a fun kill team only formation, but the real winners of the release are certainly the Tyranids, getting both the Leviathan supplement and Synaptic Links. As supplemental content goes, it actually gives a meaningful power boost to the faction, really lets them compete very well with the top tier codexes, though it quickly becomes apparent that Hive Guard double shooting with all the buffs that they can layer on them becomes very problematic. Perhaps there should have been a direct jump straight into the A tier for them, but don't worry, they're going there in a second anyway. Next up, Games Workshop introduces the concept of the balanced data slate, generally pretty well received by the community. They hand out some decent nerfs to some of the top factions, with some really quite fun and flavourful buffs to some of the ones that are struggling the most. There's a maximum of 2 flies in match play games now, particularly bad for the Orcs and Admech who are having fun spamming 6 of them. Guard get 2+ save Lehman Russes, a small boost. Knights actually become kind of playable and competitive for perhaps the first time in 9th edition, as they get OBSEC Armigers and 10 model Big Knights, meaning that they can actually score objectives for a change. Chaos Marine Melee gets a fair bit better with the Death to the False Emperor change, though I can't say it really turns their lot around all that much. Necrons get a fairly meaningful boost with a lot of their lesser played units getting core. Scorpet Destroyers, Flayed Ones, and Wraiths can all get some pretty interesting buffs now, as can Locust Heavy Destroyers. As well as not spamming planes, Orcs are now limited to 1 unit of each type of buggy. This really nerfs some of their cheesiest lists quite hard. And then for the current Kings of 9th edition, Games Workshop manages to hit Admech with some really big points nerfs. Almost every single competitive unit goes up at least a little, and it seems that they try to do the same with Drukhari, but they also take pity on some of the lesser played Covens units, decrease a bunch by a fair few points, and then all of a sudden Drukhari Thick City is born. The new top tier way to play Drukhari is to take the -1 damage traits, and then you've got an incredibly hard to shift battle line of Talos, Kronos, Rax, and Grotesques. Finally, in 2021, despite an 8th edition codex, Tyranids really cement their reputation as a top tier army. The Crusher Stampede Army of Renown comes out in a White Dwarf article, giving monsters a massive buff, -1 damage and 5+ invul saves, and more power on objectives. Despite some fairly underwhelming data sheets for the most part, they're really a faction to fear now. Having an easy way to deal out a whole ton of mortal wounds when they charge doesn't hurt either, and things like Dimacarons, Hierodules, and quite a few of the other various Tyranid monstrous creatures see regular play. Next up, we're into 2022, and potentially seeing the last of the delayed codexes from Games Workshop as they finally catch up with their pandemic backlog. The Genestealer Cult and Custodes codexes both drop. The Genestealer Cult one's really quite a nice fun rule set. They have some really powerful and interesting, slightly game-breaking options, but having quite fragile units and some of their damage output not being too spectacular still means they're not absolutely dominating the game, and are instead just a fairly nice upper mid-tier army. Interestingly, when Custodes dropped, just about everyone seemed to say that the army was very underwhelming, pointing to things like losing 3+ invul saves as a reason that the faction will be getting worse. That really doesn't turn out to be the case though. A few key stratagems can make their units a lot tougher, a lot of units got some subtle stat line buffs, Trajan Valoris is immense, and the whole army gets a couple of layers of army-wide special rules and the new martial katars and the shield host rules. Between everything, Custodians become an absolutely top-tier army, and as people start playing games it becomes apparent that they are very hard to deal with after all. Then, just a week after those codexes, Games Workshop releases the next chapter approved and the Warzone Nachman mission pack, both of which pay attention to the previous criticisms of chapter approved, and this time they actually deliver some pretty meaningful changes and really hit a lot of factions hard, a fair bit of internal codex rebalancing, but really quite a lot of nerfs to strong factions. The Nachman missions mean no more mixed sub-factions within an army. This hits Sisters of Battle and Grey Knights quite hard. Perhaps the two winners of the book are Necrons and Custodes. Necrons got a bunch of points cuts across key units, things like Scorpec destroyers going down and Flayed ones being 10 points, both were kind of helpful. Custodes also got some pretty surprising points cuts, including 10 points off Trajan Valores and 5 points off the bikes, Games Workshop seemingly buffing the units that are already some of the best in the book. Otherwise, its nerfs are really quite a lot of strong factions, though it does kind of feel like Games Workshop's reacting to the meta 6 months ago, when no doubt Chapter Approved was written and sent to the printers, and a lot of the things that get nerfed were things that were fairly strong a while back. Sisters get hit by nerfs to Retributors and Sacrosands, Orcs get a couple of buffs to weaker units, but in general their power goes down with big hits to things like the Beast Boss on Squigosaur, Squig Buggies and Scrapjets, Commandos, and many more. Grey Knights take hits to their Dread Knights and the Strike Squads, and also aren't able to spam Grand Masters as much. Space Marines get a few buffs to some of their weaker vehicles, but their power level goes down overall, taking hits to Volkite Contemptors and Redemptors. And Death Guard are hit surprisingly hard. I can only imagine that they were really quite a strong army when the book was being written, and they see some slightly annoying increases to things like Poxwalkers and Terminators, despite really not being a faction that most people are threatened by right now. Finally, for the Tyranids, both the Hive Guard and the Dimacarons go up in points a fair bit, though they still remain strong overall. The releases of January just kept on coming thick and fast though. I think Games Workshop condensing their release schedule into a really short space of time just due to it being delayed earlier. Next up is the Tau Codex, and kind of classic Games Workshop making the very weakest faction in the game arguably into pretty much the strongest. They seem to be just as strong as Custodes, if not stronger, the main strength coming from Crisis Suits with absolutely great support, Storm Surges and Broadsides having some heavy guns in the back if you need some reasonable objective holders in Devilfish with Breachers and Ethereals, and a few other very nice tricks such as loads of Ignore's line of sight firepower and the very mighty Railgun if you need to kill a hard target. After they come out, it's Tau and Custodes basically winning all the tournaments for a while, with even Tyranids struggling to compete. Not long after the Tau book drops, the next Balance Data Slate comes out as well. This one's a lot more light touch than the previous one. The only real change is some nerfs to Drukhari. The -1 damage Coven now only works on weapons that are strength 7 or less, and Talos and Kronos lose core. Finally, this actually seems to be enough to take Drukhari down a peg, certainly still remaining a strong army with options, but not quite at top tier anymore. It wouldn't really do for the Eldar not to be at the top of the tree for too long though, as then the Eldari Codex comes out, a book that saw an awful lot of leaks, but it turned out that the very strongest thing when the Codex was all put together, that Harlequins had pretty much become the strongest army in the game as soon as it came out. Considering they were perhaps seeing unseen levels of power with Tau and Custodes, it perhaps was kind of surprising to see Harlequins trounce them quite so easily. 9 Voidweavers seemed like the brain-dead easy option to include in just about every list. Fast, tough, mobile, and massive firepower. Troops in Starweavers were great units for skirmishing for objectives, and they have some crazy character builds to back them up, Death Jesters, Shadow Seers, and Troop Masters all being great. I feel like the Craft World has perhaps had their glory stolen by their hangers-on, but I feel like they're a bit more on the low key, being almost as strong as Harlequins, excellent Psychers with a crazy amount of good spells to draw from, a lot of Aspect Warriors being both quite fun and powerful to use now, things like Shining Spears, Warp Spiders, Howling Banshees, and Striking Scorpions, some very scary artillery in Shadow Weavers and D-Cannons, and Phoenix Lord Baharoth being a crazy utility beast, jumping all over the board, shooting stuff dead and then charging it before retreating to safety every turn. Now, and only a few days ago at time of recording, we have the balanced data slate. This one brought forward the best part of a month, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was partly due to the amount of complaints they were getting about the game balance they created, nerfing a bunch of the previous problem armies, only to pretty much instantly replace them with the latest round of strong stuff between Tau, Custodes, and Harlequins. This one feels like it could be quite easily the biggest shake-up to 40k 9th edition so far, to the extent where I had to go through it in sections, otherwise the chart had just turned into a massive mess. Firstly, Knights weirdly lose Towering Foe and Obsec Armigers. They're right back into being basically unplayable on objectives anymore. I don't know if Games Workshop just forgot to include it, or whether they decided to leave it out, as it's going to be added back in the Codex, and they didn't want to create confusion between the data slate and that. In any case, their Codex is coming soon. It seems pretty likely that they're going to be going towards the top tier, if 9th edition is anything to go by so far. Guard finally get a very meaningful power boost from Hammer of the Emperor. Lasguns can now genuinely stack a pretty crazy amount of saves on most targets. It does mean just about every single gun in the faction is stronger though, and they also get free gear on infantry squads, meaning that you might just be opportunistically firing a whole bunch of las cannon and plasma shots around, likely doing a fair bit of chip damage as well as your main plan. Perhaps the single biggest and most meaningful rule change of 9th edition so far, though, is Armour of Contempt. It affects every Space Marine without a Storm Shield, every Heretic Astartes, all the Adeptus Sororitas besides the Ministorum, and the Grey Knights who don't have themselves a Dread Knight. Basically, all of those units improve their save by +1 against everything that isn't an AP0 weapon. It's a genuinely huge durability buff and means that AP-1 and AP-2 weapons are going to be really bad at killing Space Marines. Obviously, this is all getting a little bit speculative now, as predicting how much of a massive rule change like that's going to impact with every single army is going to be kind of hard, but I'd estimate that that's going to be worth at least a tier rise for every single faction involved, and maybe more. Terminators of all stripes are going to particularly like this. Thousand Sons and Death Guard ones seem like big winners, Death Guard Terminators also get Obsec too, and Dark Angels might see a bit of a resurgence as well. Perhaps the Sisters of Battle and the Grey Knights don't get quite as meaningful buffs compared with the rest, as both factions have a bunch of their units that don't get the boost. Those Sisters do also double down on it with a Miracle Dice buff, getting twice as many free ones as they would before. Then, at the same time, the top factions are reined in. Harlequins, Tau and Custodes all take some very serious nerfs. The overpowered Voidweaver is punished extremely hard, getting a 40-point nerf. Starweavers are up a bit, and a couple of their best characters are toned down. The Custodes lose Obsec outside some troops, and a bunch of their most important stratagems are limited to one use only or not being used on the bikes, and Tau are hit very hard by a general nerf to indirect fire, as well as losing Montcar AP, Farside Enclave's range being reduced, and broadsides not having core. Their Crisis Suit blobs do remain pretty strong though, even if you're not going to be taking as many air-bursting fragmentation launchers. Overall, out of the three big factions, I do feel that maybe Custodes were hit a little bit harder. It's going to be interesting to see how the factions adapt, and what strong lists come to the fore, perhaps hidden behind the old strongest builds that don't work quite as well. Finally, last but not least, and this weekend as of time of recording, the Tyranids get their Codex, and it's a bit more obvious just how strong it is, as it's been leaked for the best part of a month already, so a lot of people have had chance to playtest it. Again, I guess we'll see how well it gets on against the new nerfed top factions, but it looks like it's got an enormous amount of strong things going for it, a crazily powerful psychic phase, dangerous monsters, and good faction-wide buffs like the Hive Fleet things and Synaptic Imperatives. It certainly doesn't look particularly less weak than the previous top factions before they got nerfs. In particular, I think it's going to be interesting to see what Games Workshop do with the Crusher Stampede and Leviathan supplements. Both of those also add enormous more strength to Tyranids, probably things that they don't need all that much now their codex is so good. Still though, it's definitely early days at this stage. They certainly might address a few things in the Tyranid Codex FAQ when it drops. My guess is though that they're going to be the new strongest thing in the game, and perhaps the army to fear. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a bit of a synopsis of 9th edition tier rankings, and roughly how I feel the armies have stacked up throughout the edition, at least by my rough estimates. This is just a very rough final rankings based off the balanced data slate. It'll be interesting to see if, when the game shakes out, it does roughly represent this sort of thing, or whether or not some of the armies that got that big Armour of Contempt buff actually are some of the ones to truly fear. Maybe I might have underestimated Harlequins, and maybe they might be just as strong spamming troops and Skyweavers, and I feel like I might have overestimated Admech and Orcs a little bit on this list here. I'm honestly not sure how well they're going to hold out against all that improved power armour. Of course, the edition's very much not finished with yet. There's going to be multiple upcoming codexes, first Knights, and then presumably Demons, Guard, and Chaos Marines sometime after that. I guess we'll see if Games Workshop can resist just bumping them all straight up into the A+ tier, or whether or not that's just going to continue being their modus operandi. They'll also be adding in the Leagues of Votan at some stage, and maybe even the World Eaters if the rumours are to be believed. In any case, this one's been a fun one to make. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. How's the power creep roller coaster of 9th edition been treating you so far? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the stuff on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Making all this content does take a fair amount of time. Particularly long videos like this take a lot of effort in a daily upload schedule, so if you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.